I generally like to start my courses with one question. What is history? If I were to ask you that question, what would you say? The most common answer is that history is what happened in the past. And on some level, that's true. The study of history does focus on the past. It's comprised of all the things that have happened in many different realms that have brought us to where we are today. But that definition isn't complete. It doesn't explain why, as Sam Weinberg, a historian at Stanford University, argues, we should learn history when it's already on our phone. In other words, why does the state of Georgia require you to take history when you want to be a nurse or a computer programmer or a business owner? The answer to that question lies in the true nature of history. Let me quote Weinberg for a moment. Just as math is more than a collection of theorems, history is more than a collection of facts. It's an intellectual enterprise that requires piecing together a cogent and accurate story from partial scraps of faded words. And the process never ends. Its destination leads to a new beginning. True historical inquiry must end where it begins, with a question mark. So what does that mean? Well, it means that history is more than just the sum of events that happened in the past, things that you can memorize for a test or put in a timeline or help you win at your local trivia night. History is a way of thinking about the world. Professional history emerged in the 19th century in Germany, courtesy of a man named Leopold von Ranke. Now, Ranke was not the first historian. We have storytellers who date back to the classical world. Much of what we know about the Persian Wars is courtesy of Herodotus, for example. But these early historians blended fact, fiction, and hearsay to write history that resembled epic tales. Ranke, on the other hand, argued that we need to study the past critically. We can't have this super patriotic or religious view of the past. We can't have an overly optimistic view of the past. If we want to study the past, we have to study it for what it was, good and bad. And so Ranke would come up with this principle of studying the past from a secular and unbiased, or as unbiased as possible, perspective. This was the basis of historical professionalism, studying what actually happened, not what you wish happened, according to the evidence. So history should be evidence-based. In the study of history, there are three types of sources that can be used as evidence. There are primary sources, which are sources created during the period being studied by someone with knowledge of or experience in the topic. So a journal entry, a newspaper article from the Civil War, letters, wills, tax records, all of those are examples of primary sources. There are secondary sources, which are written by scholars after the fact. They combine primary sources and existing knowledge to make new arguments about the how and why of the past. Secondary sources identify points of continuity, when things stay the same, and points of change, trying to get at causation. One way of thinking about it is to say that for historians, X factors lead to Y outcomes. So historians want to understand why things unfolded the way they did. As historians make those arguments, they write books and articles that are called secondary sources. And finally, we have tertiary sources, which are things like textbooks, encyclopedias, and informational websites like history.com. These sources provide the basic narrative, but don't really make an explicit evidence-based argument, so they're not secondary sources. They weren't produced in the period being studied, so they're not primary sources. They just give an overview, so we call them tertiary sources. They're often a good place to start, but they don't provide the rigor that's necessary for college-level work. In exploring the past, it's important to note that historians are always evaluating an incomplete record. For this, let's turn to historian Terry Crowley. History is the attempt to recreate and explain the significant features of the past on the basis of fragmentary and imperfect evidence. The historical record is incomplete for a number of reasons. One is the fact that not all documents stand the test of time. They can be destroyed by accident or intent, by natural or man-made phenomena. In general, the further back in time you go, the less likely it is that you'll have a lot of sources to choose from. In other words, if you're trying to study classical Rome, you'll have far fewer sources to examine than if you're trying to study the Cold War. In other cases, like Nazi Germany, records were intentionally destroyed. So part of it is that the record doesn't always stand the test of time. But another reason that the record is incomplete is that not all voices and not all experiences are recorded equally. There's a power dynamic at play in which social norms determined whose voices were considered worthy of remembering. In general, the wealthier and more powerful a person was, the more likely they were to have their voices recorded and remembered. This was for a couple of reasons. Number one, the elite were more likely to be literate, and literacy is important in keeping the written records that are the basis of historical study. Number two, the elite tended to make up the newspaper reporters, property owners, courts, public office holders, those who created enduring records. For example, we have plenty of records from factory owners, but far fewer from factory workers. Similarly, we have plenty of records from slave owners, but far fewer from enslaved people. We have more records from men than women. So power shapes the historical record, and there are voices and experiences missing. Historians have tried to find ways around that, and we'll look at some of the sources that historians have used to incorporate underrepresented voices into the study of history. But for now, to review, historians make arguments based on incomplete evidence, and as a result, history isn't about truth with a capital T. Contrary to what you might hear in the media or from politicians, history isn't permanent and unchanging. To quote William Faulkner, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." The events of the past don't change, but our understanding of why it happened and why it's important and what we can learn from it does. It actually changes all the time as we discover new evidence and new ways of understanding that evidence. History then lies not in facts, but in thinking. So in this course, we will explore not only the historical narrative, what happened and when, but also these historical thinking skills. We want to understand how historians make sense of the world. The way that historians look at the world is different than the way that scientists or philosophers or mathematicians do. Their way of knowing is different. So how do we think historically? Well, there are 5 essential skills that historians use to understand the past. The first is inquiry-based learning. Historians start with broad questions and then develop research strategies for answering those questions. Historians don't start with what they know, they start with what they don't know. Number 2 is chronological thinking. Historians think chronologically. They're always putting new information in context and assessing what changes over time and what stays the same. These points of continuity and change are essential to establishing causation. The third skill is primary source analysis. This means determining the value of a document for helping us understand the past. It requires moving beyond face value. Historians don't just read a document and ask what it says. They analyze its author, audience, purpose, and perspective, often called sourcing the document, to establish its credibility. They put the document in context, which means explaining how the document was informed by the world in which it was produced. They corroborate the document, comparing it to other sources from the same period to identify points of agreement and disagreement. More sources equals more proof. Finally, they engage in close reading of the text. After they've sourced, contextualized, and corroborated the evidence, historians move on to a careful reading of the source, assessing its claims and evidence. Don't worry, we'll practice this a lot. The fourth thinking skill is historical empathy. Historians practice historical empathy, which is the ability to look at the past from the past's perspective, not our own. In essence, this means putting aside judgment, particularly moral judgment, about the past in order to consider and understand why people did the things they did, given the world in which they lived. It doesn't mean you have to approve of the things that happened in the past or that you have to like it, just that understanding the past requires engaging in their world, not ours. And finally, we have evidence-based argumentation. Historians make arguments about the past based on critical reading of primary and secondary source evidence. If history is about more than memorizing names and dates and facts, if history is about making sense of incomplete evidence, then history is, at its core, about interpretation and argumentation. Now, when I say argument, I don't mean yelling and screaming and calling people names. I mean establishing a thesis, one that answers an interesting question about the past, and then proving that thesis with historically specific evidence. These are the 5 key historical thinking skills that we'll practice in this course. But for now, I want to end with another quote from Weinberg that underscores the value of the historical thinking skills that I outlined above. The study of history should be a mind-altering encounter that leaves one forever unable to consider the social world without asking questions about where a claim comes from, who's making it, and how time and place shape human behavior. As we work our way through this course, I want you to keep this in mind.